I'm John Glusman, and I'm here to talk about conduct under fire for American doctors and their fight for life as prisoners of the Japanese. The book is based on my father's experiences, along with 3 other Navy doctors, in World War II. He was stationed at the Cavite Naval Base in the Philippines, which was the base of the Asiatic Fleet, and that was bombed into inoperability 2 days after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese made a ferocious onslaught, conquering within a matter of days Wake, Guam, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines would be the last stand for the Allies in the Pacific. After Cavite was bombed, the doctors and Allied troops retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and waged a heroic but ultimately futile fight against the Japanese, which ended with the capitulation of the Allied troops on April 9th, 1942. 75,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner, and thus commenced the notorious Bataan Death March. The men had been fighting under the most horrific conditions. Many were riddled with disease, in particular malaria. They had been on half rations since January 1942, and now their fate lay in the hands of the Japanese. It's important to remember the attitudes both of the Americans towards the Japanese and the attitudes of the Japanese toward the Americans. The historian John Dower called the war in the Pacific a race war, and in many ways it was. There were gross misunderstandings, there were cultural prejudices. The idea of surrender was antithetical to the Japanese, where surrender was a fate worse than death. The men were beaten, they were tortured, they were humiliated, they were shot for no apparent reason. They were robbed of any valuables they may have had, any possessions they may have had, and it was a hellish journey. Some 65 miles to Camp O'Donnell. My father and 3 other Navy doctors, Fred Burley, John Bookman, and George Ferguson, were based in the hospitals, which were in southern Bataan, hospitals number 1 and number 2. When Bataan capitulated, my father was one of the last people off of Bataan and missed the Bataan Death March by just hours, and then made the very brief journey to Corregidor. Corregidor, known as the Rock, was considered the Gibraltar of the East. It's shaped like a tadpole and was a garrison heavily fortified. There was an extensive tunnel network dug into Malinta Hill, known as Malinta Tunnel. This is where many of the officers withdrew. Malinta Tunnel was 1,400 feet long, 30 feet wide, and had 25 lateral tunnels, some 400 feet long. It's an extraordinary complex, as were the huge seacoast guns emplaced along the coast. But my father was stationed in the field, not in the hospital in Malinta Tunnel. They were bivouacked, attached to the 4th Marines, and their duty was to save as many lives, to treat as many wounded as possible. The attack was fiercest. It was the 2nd heaviest bombardment in World War II. My father said it was one continuous explosion, and one of the seacoast batteries, Geary, received a direct hit. He said, "I thought the whole goddamn island had exploded." It was an impossible yet valiant defense from the beginning, because Corregidor was designed to defend an attack by sea, not from Japanese artillery and not from Japanese air power. The end came in the early morning hours of May 6th, when the Japanese landed on the tail of the tadpole, so to speak, near Monkey Point. And at that point, tanks began to land as well. That was all that General Wainwright, in spite of MacArthur's orders, needed to realize that to continue fighting was utterly hopeless, and he surrendered. Corregidor which marked the fall of the Philippines. That was on May 6, 1942. Thus began the odyssey of my father and his three colleagues, John, George, and Fred Burley, as prisoners of war. An odyssey that did not end until the Japanese surrender on August 15th, 1945. They were doctors, they were extremely well educated, they were older than the average troops, and now they were POWs, prisoners of war, some of whom were led to Bilibid prison, which was the common municipal jail in Manila. Others were led to Cabanatuan, a facility 60 miles north of Manila in flat rice-growing country. The Navy doctors ran Bilibid as a Navy hospital to the extent that they could. The Army doctors ran Cabanatuan. These doctors were first, the Navy doctors were first imprisoned in Bilibid. They worked as doctors to the extent that they could with a minimum of medicine, a minimum of equipment, and a minimum of food. The diseases ranged from malaria, which 80% of the troops suffered from, to dysentery, to wet and dry beriberi, to diphtheria, tetanus. Many of the men had cross infections, and malaria then was only treated by quinine. This was before penicillin, before antibiotics. As my father said, we could have saved so many men when he learned of penicillin on his way back from Japan. Many men succumbed from these diseases. Many men succumbed from starvation as well. The men were fed rice. They were on minimal rations. Remember, they had been on half rations under MacArthur's orders while they were on Bataan. They began dropping weight and more weight and more weight. And their food consisted primarily of rice and greens, maybe a little tea, and little else. The so-called paracap of the grains of rice had been removed, and it was in the paracap that many of the nutrients are in rice. So even though they may have a bowl of rice and greens and a little tea, if that were available, a cigarette which could help assuage hunger, their caloric intake plummeted. This made the men, given their many, many cross infections, that much more susceptible. And many were lost simply because of the lack of medicine and the lack of food. But it was run as a Navy hospital. And one of the things I discovered very early on in my research was the advantage of writing about Navy doctors, in particular at Bilibid, because they kept written records. On my first foray into the National Archives in Washington, D.C., while I was looking at some of the original material from the camps, to my astonishment, I came across patient notes my father had written in Bilibid, treating Allied POWs, signed Murray Glusman. They were about the size of a typical file card, but because there was so little paper, they were fashioned from immigration certificates that were given to Chinese laborers in the 1920s, and then cut up, and the backside of the paper was used for these index cards, which give a detailed account of disease and the trials that those in prison, including the doctors, faced. In addition, there are other officers who kept diaries. Commander Thomas Hayes, who was a Navy officer at Bilibid, kept an extensive diary. After appalling fighting that took a huge toll on the civilian population, they had buried their diaries in pneumatic tubes, and these were discovered when Bilibid was retaken by the Americans shortly thereafter. This provided primary source material for me, primary source material to tell the story, both of the Navy doctors and the prisoners at Bilibid. From Bilibid, they were moved to Cabanatuan, as mentioned, 60 miles north in flat rice-growing country. The health crises among the POWs grew worse as food grew scarcer. Dysentery was an enormous problem. There were funerals every day for POWs who had died of starvation or died of dysentery or died of a combination of the two or more diseases. The Navy doctors worked on the so-called farm, where they raised vegetables, where they cultivated a vegetable very much like our sweet potato. The sweet potatoes were not for the prisoners, the greens were. The sweet potatoes went to the Japanese guards and staff. Let's talk about the treatment of the prisoners of war by the Japanese. They were held in contempt, they were looked down upon, they were humiliated. The men themselves were nothing more than a Japanese undergarment known as a fundoshi. They teased POWs, they berated them, they beat them, and they sometimes tortured them. My father was able to learn enough Japanese to be able to communicate, which was a huge asset. Many of the POWs could not, but they were all too happy to ridicule the Japanese guards, who they gave names such as Dopey or Sleepy, or pick a character out of a Disney cartoon, which initially some of the guards were quite pleased with it. They had an American nickname until they realized that these in effect were epithets. They remained in Cabanatuan until late 1944. By then, the Japanese had begun transporting POWs to Japan. My father surmised that it would make more sense if they could to leave the Philippines sooner rather than later, on the expectation and belief, and they always believed, that the Philippines would be retaken, liberated by the Americans, and that Japan would be defeated. They had by this time vowed to stay together. Their ethos was a one for all for one. And no doubt this was a factor in helping them stay alive, being a part of a band of brothers, so to speak. But when a potential time came for departure on a Japanese merchant vessel, George Ferguson had dysentery. And all of the POWs were tested for dysentery before they left the Philippines. My father and I believe Fred Burley suggested to George that they could fake a dysentery test to prove that in fact he had a clean bill of health. George refused and said, "I'll be fine. I'll see you guys later." They never saw him again. Fred, John, and Murray were transported on an unmarked Japanese merchant vessel called the Kenwa Maru. Meanwhile, the United States Navy had embarked upon a ferocious submarine campaign against the Japanese merchant marine. These ships were unmarked. Many of them ended up being targets. Many ships were sunk by U.S. submariners. Though the United States had clear intelligence that these ships were in fact carrying prisoners of war. The men arrived in Moji and then were transported to the Osaka area. First imprisoned in a camp under the Osaka camp system, then in a makeshift camp called Ichioka, which my father described as a hellhole, which was effectively a camp beneath the bleachers of a stadium in Osaka. And they had to evacuate that once the American firebombing of Japan had begun. The low-altitude firebombing of Japan was initiated by General Curtis, known as the Cigar, because he was always chomping on a cigar, LeMay, of the 21st Bomber Command. High-altitude, so-called precision bombing had failed. Bombs missed their targets. The winds were a huge obstacle to high-altitude bombing. LeMay decided to switch to low-altitude bombing at 10,000 feet or less. The planes, B-29s, which took off from the Marianas, would be stripped of almost everything because of the length of the trip. They could barely make a trip to the Japanese mainland and back, given the huge distances. They would lighten the planes to arm them fully with the bombs, the equivalent of napalm, which would incinerate Japanese cities. The United States had tested this strategy by building mock Japanese cities, or compounds, houses that were mostly wood. Walls were made of paper. Tatami mats of straw were used on the floor. This was the perfect kindling for napalm. and the cities were devastated. If you look at some of the photographs in Conduct Under Fire, you'll see one of Kobe as well, which became a target on June 5th, 1945. That's where my father and his buddies were in a hospital run by a Japanese commandant, Ohashi. This began the darkest chapter and the last chapter of the POWs' odyssey in Japan, which they had described as a journey through the Valley of Death. They set out for a makeshift camp called Maruyama. Desperate for food, their rations were down to 800 calories a day. And at that rate, in August of 1945, they calculated that they would not survive past September. Men had dropped 10, 20, 30, 40 pounds. My father, before the war, was at about 200 pounds, was down to about 160. But even though Japan had surrendered on August 15th, 1945, and the camps were evacuated by the Japanese, that didn't mean that the role of the Navy doctors was over. Instead, they made a perilous trek to Tokyo through an absolute wasteland as a result of the bombing in March 1945, and found themselves at a standing structure, which was the Imperial Hotel, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, which had survived a huge earthquake in the 1920s and was still intact. Their mission was a mission of mercy. It was to notify MacArthur and the authorities that if they didn't get immediate aid to the POW camps, more and more and more POWs would die simply of starvation. They ran headlong into the Japanese secret police, known as the Kempeitai, were threatened by the Kempeitai, were challenged by the Kempeitai, and in one remarkable encounter, after being chastised and humiliated, and being asked if anyone knew where they were, my father spoke out in anger and said these words, which I've had corroborated by Fred Burley. "Listen, you goddamn son of a bitch. If you don't show us the respect that is our due as offers of the United States Navy, I'll see to it that your ass is strung from the highest lamppost in Tokyo." Fred Burley was astonished. In retrospect, I think my father was astonished as well, but they had been through 3.5 years of hell. And what he noticed was that this Japanese member of the Kempeitai backed down entirely. Within days, they were able to locate the American authorities, but this was actually before MacArthur had landed. As far as I can tell, the Americans, Fred Burley, Murray Glusman, and John Bookman, were among the first Americans in Tokyo after the Japanese surrender. And when they returned to Maruyama, they found that indeed supplies had been airdropped, not only in the Osaka area, but throughout Japan. The war was over, but it was not over for the Japanese, and it was not over in particular for their last commandant. While many of the Japanese guards and many of the Japanese commandants could be vicious in their treatment of POWs, completely insensitive to their well-being, Ohashi was a doctor, and he was described as not only a doctor, as a gentleman who was fascinated by Western medicine. And while there's a photograph of the men at their camp in Kobe before Kobe was bombed, there's a rather chilling portrait of Ohashi standing out in front of the Allied doctors. But in fact, he was a man of great sensitivity and did everything he could to make life as tolerable as possible. He knew that the Japanese were doomed. And at the end of the war, as U.S. authorities launched a kind of dragnet to locate and capture as many Japanese as possible, with the intention of charging, if necessary, them with war crimes, Ohashi was caught up in the same dragnet. It was a letter that 3 of the Navy doctors wrote to the authorities saying that Ohashi had been anything but a war criminal. To the contrary, he had done everything he could to assist the Navy doctors to improve the well-being of the POWs under the most horrific of circumstances. And even though Ohashi was held in Sugamo prison, which is where suspected war criminals were held, he was ultimately released and never charged with any war crimes. Miraculously, I was able to track down his daughters. I was able to track down his grandson. We had an extraordinary meal, which was a kind of cultural handshake across the ocean. When he could hear stories he had never heard from, when Ohashi's grandson could hear stories that he knew very little about because his grandfather had died in the 1950s. He and I struck up a friendship, met recently in New York City, and it felt to me as an author, as a researcher, and as the son of a former POW, in a way like touching history. Sadly, George Ferguson never came home. George was one of 1,800 POWs on a ship that left the Philippines called the Arison Maru. This was in October of 1945. This was also when the Submariners' War against the Japanese was at its absolute height in preparation for the invasion of Leyte. The Arison Maru was torpedoed by American submarines, and it sank. Of 1,800 men, only 8 survived, and George Ferguson was one of the ones who went down. When I initially told my father I wanted to write Conduct Under Fire, and I had the good fortune to be able to travel to the Philippines with him to retrace his journey, he said, "Why?" And I was surprised by the question, because I thought his story was so extraordinary and I knew so little about it, as many families of ex-POWs have also experienced. And he said, "My story is nothing remarkable. We did nothing extraordinary. We lived in extraordinary times." I encountered that sentiment among many of the ex-POWs who I interviewed, many of the ex-POWs whose transcripts of interviews I have read. A tremendous humility and also a tremendous sadness on coming home. They weren't fed it like GIs in Europe. And as my father said, we lost our part of the war. They also felt that no one could understand what they had gone through. They had been prisoners for nearly 3.5 years. Time had passed them by. My father lost the woman he thought would be his fiancée, who had married another man. He realized that he was far behind in his medical knowledge, and what he wanted to do was not look back, but to look forward. As a child, there were 1 or 2 stories I heard from him, and nothing more. So this book was really created from scratch. My father had the chance to read it, was enormously proud of it, which made me enormously proud. Sadly, he died before its publication. I met many extraordinary people, or people I consider extraordinary. These Navy doctors were, in my opinion, heroes. They saved lives. The story of George Ferguson is a tragedy among thousands of tragic stories of World War II. One of the most rewarding moments of my research was when I was able to track down Lucy Ferguson, the widow of George Ferguson. They had had their so-called honeymoon in Shanghai, not a real honeymoon because George was on the Yangtze Patrol. But Shanghai was a beautiful, beautiful city before the war, as was Manila. She was sent home when George was sent to the Philippines, and they never really had that honeymoon. And when I met with Lucy in Wausau, Wisconsin, she was in the very same home that she had lived in at the time that she was greeted by representatives of the U.S. Navy informing her that George was, in fact, dead. She never remarried. I remember looking at some VA studies in my research to see the lasting consequences of imprisonment among ex-POWs. Many, towards the end of their lives, suffered from depression, alcoholism. There were suicides, and it's clear that this experience, which troops who may have been as young as teenagers suffered, as well as officers who became prisoners of the Japanese, lasted with them to the end of their days. My father was one of the lucky ones. He was 86 when we went to the Philippines together. He was able to read Conduct Under Fire, and he had survived, living to the ripe old age of 90. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Where are you joining us from?
I am joining you from my home office, and I'm sitting in front of a wall of books, which were part of the research I did for Conduct Under Fire. And if you look closely, you'll recognize some of those titles.
My eyesight's terrible, so I won't strain it, but I just wanted to say thank you for joining us. That's an incredibly powerful story that you've just recounted. I wanted to start off by asking you, were you a little bit nervous, a bit full of trepidation when you decided to write this book about your father? I mean, what was the genesis of the book?
The genesis of the book was when my father was, I had written an article for the Virginia Quarterly Review many years prior to my trip to Corregidor in Japan, and my father wanted to take a second trip. And he was in his late 80s, and I thought, why not go with him? And I initially envisioned this as a magazine article. In fact, it was commissioned by Travel and Leisure, of all places. Not much was leisurely about this traveling, but it was revelatory. And then I was encouraged to write a book, which I resisted with all of my might and energy, Alex, as a book editor, because I know how much work is involved. I would much rather read them than write them, and read yours than write mine. But I was persuaded, and my father was taken aback, and he said, "Why do you want to do this?" And I think I quoted this in my presentations, or said this in my presentation. He said, "We did nothing extraordinary. We lived in extraordinary times." And then once I began the research, I saw how extraordinary this chapter of the war really was. So that was the only moment of hesitation.
So how old was your father when he was a prisoner, when he became prisoner?
26 years old.
So he was actually a few years older than most of the guys with him.
That's right. There were Navy corpsmen with whom he worked, and the doctors were very close to the corpsmen. There was a really strong and affectionate and supportive relationship, because they depended on them to be stretcher bearers, among other things. Some of the airmen, Marines, men in the Army could be in their teens. They would lie about their age. So yes, the doctors were older. As I said, they were more educated, obviously being doctors, and they kept written records to the extent that they could, at least in Bilibid.
So you probably heard this before. My grandparents refused to have anything Japanese. So if in England in the 1970s, if you were among those odd few people that drove a Japanese car, woe betide you parking that anywhere in public. How did your father feel about the Japanese for the rest of his life?
This is a really interesting question, and my father felt similarly. Though he did accept one holiday gift from a patient of his, which was a miniature Sony TV, I remember. I think that may have been the only Japanese product we had in our household. Um, he would never forgive them, with the exception of Ohashi. We were very briefly in Japan, back at the Imperial Hotel, which he had not been in since August of 1945. And he was distinctly uncomfortable. I've actually never seen him so anxious as when we landed at the airport in Tokyo, and he knew that we were driving through latter day Tokyo, which of course bore no resemblance to the Tokyo as he last saw it. And I know it wasn't an easy experience for him. Um, we stayed only one night in Tokyo, and I met either the manager or the assistant manager of the Imperial Hotel, and told him, introduced him to my father, and shared a very little bit of his story. And he, in all politeness, replied, "War is very, very, very bad." And I could tell my father didn't believe a word of it. Even this was somebody who was generations removed from the war. By contrast, he felt very comfortable in the Philippines and loved the Filipino people, as many Americans before the war and during the war certainly did. And that was a wonderful part of the journey as well. I made a separate trip to Japan with a Japanese researcher. I didn't even ask my father if he wanted to go on that trip, because I knew remembered how uncomfortable he had been in Japan. And he was an elderly man in his late 80s.
So how was his health affected after the war? Did he have permanent effects from that period?
I think one of the conditions, and Dad wrote a paper about this shortly after the war, that many of the men, and most of them suffered from malnutrition, was a condition known as burning feet. And it became intolerable to walk. It felt as if the soles of your feet were on fire, and this was due to a vitamin deficiency. The symptoms of that um, did persist for some of the men, even for John Bookman, for many, many, many years. I think less than the physical trauma, which was extraordinary. I don't mean to underplay that at all, as you've seen from the photographs of the men who were liberated, POWs who were liberated at the end of the war. They look like concentration survivors of German concentration camps. I think the effects the scars were more psychic. Remember, this was before post-traumatic stress disorder was recognized as a valid medical condition. And certainly depression stalked them. And I remember reading some of the Veterans Administration studies of ex-POWs. And toward the end of ex-POWs' lives, you saw a resurgence in depression, in drinking, and even in suicide attempts. Psychically, psychologically, I don't think the war left any of them, which is why so many of them were so reluctant to speak about it. They didn't want to relive those memories.
Before I go to some of the questions we've had from our very loyal, awesome audience, I posted a photograph in the chat of the cover of John Dower's book, and I'm sure you've read War Without
Oh,
Mercy.
sure. Yeah.
I hate to mention other books when I'm talking to authors, but anyway, the reason why I did that is because you earlier on had mentioned that the war in the Pacific was somewhat of a race war, and that's the main thesis of Dower in his book. So I wanted to, before coming to the specific questions, I wanted to chat with you a little bit about that, because I think that a lot of people, when they look at the Pacific, don't acknowledge the fact that it was such a vicious, brutal, dark race war in many ways. Can you talk a little bit about that? How does the Pacific differ to the European war?
It differs substantially. And I do want to recommend to the audience, if you haven't read John Dower's book, please do. It is remarkable. And John had read my book, and I knew I was up against a very tough critic. But he found it balanced, and I wanted to take in, obviously, not only the Allied perspective, but the perspective of the Japanese as well. Japan was long suspicious of foreigners and had Americans in particular, ever since Perry arrived and Japan was supposedly opened up. And there was an enormous amount of racial prejudice against both Japanese and Chinese in America in the 19th century, and certainly in Japan as well. And then this cult of the samurai, the code of Bushido, had been resurrected by national governments for several decades. And along with that went this campaign to really subjugate all other Asian nations. So this wasn't just a race war against Americans. It was also against the Chinese, who suffered far more than the Americans in terms of deaths. And this was incorporated or inculcated by, I would say, every level of the Japanese army. So they did another hugely important point is that the Japanese signed, but they did not ratify the Geneva Convention. So the treatment of the prisoners of war was entirely different. The mortality rates were exponentially higher in the Pacific theater than they were in the European theater. And those are the factors that went into sort of codifying a kind of racial prejudice.
Thank you very much. I have a first question here. At what point in your father's story do you think that you would have reached your own breaking point? That's not my question, by the way. It's a question from one of our viewers. Do you think that you would?
Well, let me put it this way. I can't answer that question.
Yeah. Sure.
It has amazed me what not only my father, but many other ex-POWs who suffered far worse than he did went through. But I will share a remark of my brother's after he visited Corregidor. For the first time, he said, "I would have gone crazy. I don't know how Dad got through it."
We often have a factor with children of Holocaust survivors, with children of combat veterans, where the children feel like they have to somehow overperform or fully utilize every second of their lives because of what their parents endured, etc. Did you feel the weight of expectation to be what your father might expect you to be?
That's an excellent question, and I would attribute the weight of those expectations more to his being a first-generation American Jew. His parents, my grandparents, were Ukrainian, came over from Kiev and Odessa in the very early part of the 20th century. Actually, my grandfather, I believe, to escape conscription in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. And they were very Russian, very foreign to me. I remember them well as their grandson or one of their grandchildren. And they had hugely high expectations for my father as a first-generation American. And their two other children, my aunt and my uncle, Sidney and Estelle. And what my father wanted to do, having been brought up in a very conservative Jewish home, they were kosher. He was bar mitzvahed. If you see photographs from them in the early 1920s, they were very formal, obviously quite prosperous. My grandfather was a pharmacist and then went into real estate. And my father wanted to have absolutely nothing to do with the old world culture. He abandoned his Judaism, so to speak. He dated many non-Jewish women. He married my wonderful mother, who claimed my father was the first Jew she ever met. She grew up on a Midwestern farm. I totally believe her, no reason to doubt her. So I would attribute that, or think that that might be more of an influence, possibly hardened, quite likely hardened, actually, by his POW experience. But he really, it didn't, as children growing up, this wasn't a factor in our lives because we knew so little about it. One of the few ways we knew something about it was when he would have reunions every few years with John Bookman, who was a very close family friend, lived on the Upper East Side. We lived on the Upper East Side. My mother was very friendly with John's wife, Ruth, and Fred Burley, who had a practice down in Florida. We'd see Fred every couple of years. And as children, the first time we visited Fred, we were all struck by the fact that this retired Rear Admiral Burley, that his children stood before dinner was served and answered yes sir, no sir to Fred, and yes sir and yes ma'am, no ma'am to his lovely wife Camille. When to us he was just Dr. Burley and it was Mrs. Burley. So there was a little bit of military discipline that was introduced to his personal life, which my father also smiled at. It was not his way at all with us.
So we have a question here from David Trail. I want to say hi to David because I spent an awesome time with him in Florida. How has your father's story influenced your own life beside writing this book? And I actually wanted to add a further question to that. Sorry to confuse you, but did writing the book change you in some ways?
I think inevitably it did. It was the research was an extraordinary experience. The archival research, the people I met who were a part of the war in the Pacific Theater, and the process of writing the book I found absolutely fascinating, Alex, because my profession is as an editor. So I've edited hundreds and hundreds of supremely talented people. And I remember sitting down at my word processor in the Seton Hall Library when we lived in South Orange, New Jersey, when it came time for me to write. I gave myself 12 months to research the book. It took 14 months, so I was a little, no, I think it was about 12 months to research the book. I wanted to write it in 24 months. I wrote it, I think, in about 26 months. I was a little late. But when I first sat down to my typewriter, and it wasn't a word processor, it was a typewriter, in the Seton Hall Library, I had that moment of panic that I know all of my writers have gone through, which made me both empathetic and even tougher on them, I must say, which was, what if nothing comes? What if I'm sitting there before a blank screen and nothing comes? And that was the one moment of doubt, and the stories just poured out effortlessly. It was an enormous amount of fun to write, even though it was such a dark story. And I learned so much. And the biggest sign of approval for me is not from the critics, is not from the reviewers, some of whom are going to praise your work, others who are going to be less praiseworthy, but it's from the veterans. Who, if you made a mistake, and I did make one mistake in my presentation, and we'll see if anybody catches me on it. The Eris and Maru set sail in October of 1944, not October of 1945.
I was about to interject there and be a smart ass, but I won't.
Yeah, well, I preempted that. And they would too. They would nail you for it. And I would say almost all of the criticism, so to speak, was very, very positive and grateful, because I was, by unearthing these stories, I was sharing stories that were very similar to the stories they had possibly not heard, or only heard in part, or researched on their own, of the fathers and mothers who had been a part, and by that I mean in the nursing corps, army nurses. That this, in some ways, was a validation of that experience, and for me, it was an education. This is my first book. Like all first books, or like all authors, I know I would write it very differently today. But I had to, the book is dedicated to my three children, one of whom is a doctor, another of whom is in clinical psychology, and a third, our youngest, Graham, is a lawyer. And I dedicated it to them because I wanted the story to be passed down through the generations. I wanted them to learn about what I knew nothing about. And I realized that the sons and daughters of veterans and of ex-POWs were likely to know very little about the war in the Pacific theater in particular. That was the goal. I hope I achieved that objective. But the experience of writing the book was wonderfully rewarding. Though I would recommend to most of my authors, don't try to do this when you have a full-time job. It's not easy.
We have a comment that I think echoes everybody else, certainly me, from Robert. Excellent presentation. One of the best I've heard on the war. Thank you. That's high praise indeed. And then a question.
Thank you very much.
It was superb. Thank you. Question from Mark. What happened to the other doctors mentioned? I mean, we know that one, you've told us the story of one, but what happened to the other doctors after the war?
They had very successful, lucrative practices, and John was a general practitioner. And as I said, was a very close friend of my father's. And Fred was a surgeon, and remained in the Navy, retired from the Navy, had a large family. And my father we would see John and his wife Ruth quite frequently. We went to school with one of their children, Richard Bookman, who also became a doctor. Went to summer camp with him as well, and they remained very, very close. And we did not sit at the table when John and Fred came to our house for dinners as children. But what struck my mother, and I believe Ruth said this, and I'm sure Camille would have agreed with this, what they were struck by at these reunions was not only the incredible warmth that remained, and affection that the men had for one another, but the laughter, which is another survival mechanism, of course. And that's one way one gets through life when life seems all but intolerable. And fortunately, that remained. But we were not a part of it. We were not privileged to that as children.
I just wanted to ask quickly, what kind of father was he to you? Was he close? Was he fairly remote? What kind of father was he to you?
I would describe him, and if Dad were sitting right next to me, and sometimes it feels as if he's not sitting right next to me, he's definitely looking over my shoulder. He was quite remote as a father when I was younger. And this may be unfair to characterize him this way, and a generation that way. I feel as if that wasn't that uncommon among men of that generation. We had a very difficult adolescence growing up in the late 60s and early 70s. There was a huge generation gap. The Vietnam War was raging, and our lifestyle and our ambition was so foreign to his, probably just as foreign as his own was to his Russian parents, who remained very Russian or Ukrainian to the end of their lives. This trip brought us closer together than ever. And It sounds odd to say this, but we had an amazing time. He was amazingly, even to go back into Melinda Tunnel, even to try to retrace where they were in Government Ravine, even to be at mile zero or kilometer zero of the Bataan Death March. It brought us so much closer. There were times during the research when he'd say, "Johnny, why do you need to know this?" And I said, I would say, "Answer the question, please." I'm writing the book. I'm researching the book. If I have a question for you, I'm the one to ask the questions, not you. And at one point, I put a gag order on him. I told him he couldn't write anything in the newspaper about his experiences. I said, "You can't do this before the book is published." And he laughed and he said, "Are you putting a gag order on me?" And I said, "Yes. You know, you ex-Navy POWs from the war in the Pacific are a dime a dozen." He loved it. So it brought us very, very close together, and then close to one another. And then also I heard about his responses from other family friends. And it could not have been more gratifying. I feel incredibly lucky to have had this opportunity, and I'm so glad I was nudged into it, and so glad I did the work it took to research and write Conduct Under Fire.
Well, we're sadly running out of time. I think everybody can see some of the questions in the chat. We have a really good one from Janice Blake, who's a longtime viewer, a big supporter of Friends. I wanted to say on behalf of Friends, John, thank you for taking the time to join us. Thank you for writing a fantastic book. I hope everybody goes out and reads it and spreads the word. It's a really deeply moving, inspiring story, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Alex. I see one last question here. And of course, we did discuss the dropping of the bomb. And I'm happy to have that discussion offline since we're at an end here. And you can visit my website, johnaglusman.com, which is an extensive visual and also partly auditory presentation of the research in the writing of Conduct Under Fire. Thank you once again, and I'm really honored to be a part of this discussion.
Well, thank you. Thank you from us. I hope everybody joins us at top of the hour, because we have another wonderful guest, Norman Oler. And again, John, thanks so much. You've been awesome.
My pleasure. Thank you, Alex. Good to see you.
Cheers. Bye.